Astley Castle is an ancient fortified manor house on a site that has been in constant occupation for more than 1,000 years. It is a building of national significance, associated through ownership by the Grey family with 3 Queens of England. It sits in a landscape which includes a moat, gateway, curtain walls, lake, church, and traces of Elizabethan pleasure gardens. In 1674, the castle was bought by the Newdigate family, who still own the neighbouring Arbory estate. After World War II, the castle became a hotel, but was gutted by a mysterious fire in 1978. Vandalism, unauthorised stripping out and collapse made its plight still worse. Astley Castle became a ruin. The site was so large and so complex that for many years no solution could be found to give it a future. Astley Castle was in danger of total collapse. It was in desperate need of attention. Its scale and a lack of surviving detail made a traditional conservation and restoration scheme out of the question. Then, in 2005, a radical proposal was put forward by the Landmark Trust, a building preservation charity, to reinstate occupancy of Astley Castle in a manner appropriate for the 21st century. An architectural competition was held. The winning scheme was by Witherford Watson Mann Architects. It focused on reviving the oldest part of the structure and creating new accommodation in dialogue with the long history of the building.
I guess there were two sort of challenges from the outset. One was where and sort of how to make a house in the ruin, what the ruin would do for a house and what a house would do for the ruin. And the second one really was about what the experience of being in this landscape could be about. And I think we were looking at both those aspects, and that pretty much led to the first kind of real strategy was about how the new building could stabilise the ruin.
It seemed just
economical at one level, and sort of
you
make one thing do 2 jobs.
Yeah, and I remember you and Chris were very, because I was sort of pushing at one point that we might look at putting the house in the Elizabethan part, and you were very keen that it would actually be that you'd reoccupy the oldest part.
The scheme proposed to put a large open-plan living area on the first floor, on the same site as the original 13th century hall, where the Lord and his retainer also lived.
So I suppose actually that was one of our strong kind of ideas in terms of the organisation of the house at competition stage, which I think stood the test of the entire process, was to invert the conventional house, which was partly about kind of responding to the scale of spaces, but to put the bedrooms on the ground floor and to make this really beautiful upstairs room, which would be the full dimensions of the kind of medieval masonry walls, which would be a kind of combined living, kitchen and dining space, which would then really give you these extensive views out over this fantastic landscape and be kind of a very vivid part of sort of staying in the house. What we found suggested quite a lot, to us at least, it suggested quite a lot of what we did. I mean, we weren't trying to invent an upside down house, or it wasn't sort of an idea which came from somewhere else that we've tried before and this seemed like the right place to do it. That was really born out of looking at the views, as William said, the scale of the openings in the upper room, some of the constraints at the lower level in terms of light and stuff, and it kind of, in a way, it was really quite a strong response to the room that we found.
All necessary planning and listed building consents were achieved, but before this exciting vision could be realised, the structure of the castle had to be cleared of rubble and made safe. Alistair Dick Cleland, Landmark's project manager, explains how Landmark approached this, the most critical and delicate part of the process.
So phase one at Astley Castle was clearance and consolidation. The building was absolutely chock-a-block with all the collapsed masonry and timbers from the fallen historic walls. So that all had to be cleared out first. And then very slowly we had to piece the walls back together again. They were in a pretty poor condition after 30 years of being exposed to the elements. And it took a lot of work and trouble to get that back together again.
As areas were cleared, the spaces that emerged from the rubble could be properly assessed and surveyed for the first time. The remains of the building comprised sections of wall, some up to 800 years old, up to 1 metre thick and in very dire condition. The walls were stabilised using an almost invisible technique called syntech drilling.
We've used a lot of syntech ties in the repair of the buildings. These are a patented system whereby a hole is drilled into the wall using a non-percussive diamond tip drill. Then in the hole you insert a stainless steel rod which is wrapped in a fabric sock, and it also has a tube running down the middle. You then pump a grout to the far end of the sock and it slowly expands into all the voids and cavities in the wall, and in that way it stitches and knits it all together. So it's a very neat, discreet way of giving a good structural repair to very damaged walls.
After stabilisation and repointing of the old stone walls, the next phase of the project could begin. As the site was prepared for the construction of the new accommodation, archaeologists worked alongside the building team to excavate footings and trenches. The castle continued to puzzle and surprise.
Well, it had been fairly stripped out before it was converted into a hotel, but we found things like some of the old Newell stone steps from the spiral staircase, which had long been taken out. We found pieces of what we think are almost certainly window tracery from the demolished nave to Astley Church, and curious little things like stonemasons' marks on the windowsills.
The remains of the old castle formed a structure of 2 halves. The solution to linking these 2 halves together was 2 huge concrete lintels.
And the big concrete lintels, as part of a new build, all had to be craned into position from the outer bank of the moat because we couldn't get a crane big enough through the archway onto the moated site. So we had to have an even bigger crane than we would have done otherwise. The heaviest lintel was over 5 tons in weight and had to be lowered down through a slot in the scaffold roof with millimetre precision to bear onto its new brickwork piers.
The construction of the accommodation inside the building meant that new building materials needed to be chosen. These materials had to be sympathetic to the old stone walls, providing structural support in some areas whilst impacting as little as possible in others.
The story for a lot of the decisions we had to make as the design developed was it was all about these kind of junctions, and the new brick which we were proposing to employ dealt with all the irregularities of the masonry that we inherited, and it eventually became very clear that we only built the new masonry on the old masonry wall lines. We didn't introduce any new masonry wall lines, and that really helped us to stabilise and sharpen and make openings within that for then more precise elements like the joinery to then bear on or fit into it. And that gradually became a very, very clear, and it was probably maybe even 2 years into the project when we produced the model which showed these sort of 3 elements, in a way the stabilised ruin, the new brickwork within that, and then the joinery that then sits within the new brickwork to make the kind of habitable spaces.
Where this is then like a sort of rotten tooth, and it really is in the sense that it's kind of actually strong on the outside but just it's all gone on the inside, and then this is kind of an armature of concrete and obviously steel within the concrete, binding that together through the brickwork.
Freddie then spent a very long time turning that idea into a whole set of kind of very specific details. So that's what led to the proposal for the brick, in that unlike a standard sort of British brick, it's not as high. which means
34 millimetres.
It's 40 mil. There you are.
Okay.
Which means you can follow the lines of the irregular masonry a little more tightly.
The internal finishes complement both new and old structures, adding comfort and warmth whilst harking back to the ancient history of the castle. The result is a building that combines the metaphysical power of ancient ruins with intelligent modern architecture to create a powerful and thought-provoking experience. It also heralds a new approach to saving ruinous buildings, as Landmark's new director Anna Kay explains.
I think that Astley Castle represents a completely new era in the Landmark Trust's work, which has been going on for half a century already, which is representative of the kind of scope there is to rescue historic buildings in imaginative and surprising and extraordinary ways. So whereas historically the approach really, by and large, by lots of organisations, including the Landmark, was to carefully restore something to its a state that it had in the past. At Astley Castle, a building that seemed completely unsavable, which was more or less about to descend into just a series of piles of stones on the ground, a kind of new era completely has been instituted in that building's history with this beautiful, extraordinary, thought-provoking intervention by a modern architect, and the result is quite without parallel. It shows that the possibilities with historic buildings are much, much broader than you might imagine, and that it isn't simply always about, lime plaster and hammer beam roofs, but the juxtaposition of the beautiful and old and patinated with the new and the crisp and the sharp can work so beautifully and can create a space that really works well for the 21st century.